This is the Motherlands podcast. The intention of this podcast is to provide evidence-based information through honest conversations on fertility, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and beyond by bridging together the two worlds of allopathic medicine and holistic practices to improve the reproductive health outcomes of women. I am your host, Keely Semler. Hi, welcome back to the Motherlands podcast. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with Nkem Ndefo. If you're not familiar with Nkem, she's the founder of Lumos Transforms, which is an organization that seeks to create socio-cultural systems that are healthy, balanced, interdependent, sustainable, and equitable. Nkem is also the creator of the Resilience Toolkit, which is a transformative stress management and trauma healing modality that is currently being practiced all over the world. Together, we discuss the difference between reliving trauma and revisiting trauma. Nkem speaks of her experience as a nurse midwife, how informed consent, or the idea of someone being educated and aware of the choices being made about their health, is a complex problem, as there so often is unequal power dynamics within a hospital setting. We talk about how trust is built with a provider. It isn't just given. And how birth plans can often display someone's need to be in control, which can ultimately contribute to adverse outcomes. Sometimes the very need to be in control, or black and white thinking, is in fact a symptom of trauma. As always, thank you for being here. Please be sure to rate, review, and share this episode of Motherlands with anyone you think would enjoy it. Thank you so much. When I first heard you speak, it was at Nancy Beta's house, and she is one of my mentors. And I was just incredibly moved by how you speak about trauma and resilience, and something really clicked in me. Something you said, it made me realize that I don't need to relive trauma to heal from it. I don't know why that clicked or why that matters, but I know that there are so many teachings and practices out there that tell people that they have to relive their trauma in order to heal from it, or to heal their inner child by revisiting things. And there was just something so simple and refreshing and easy to digest. So I'm wondering, for anyone listening, how do you define trauma? And is there a difference between trauma versus stress, or does it even matter?
All right, there's a lot of questions there. And I want to revisit this idea about reliving or going back to revisiting. There's a difference between reliving and revisiting, and that's an important distinction. With a long COVID brain, you're going to probably have to remind me of these three things. Yes, there's a difference between stress and trauma. Is it a clear line? It's like, when does somebody go from early to active labor? It's not a clear line. When is the end of pregnancy to the start of early labor? It's not a clear line. Some of these are artificial. However, there are characteristics of trauma. Sort of the short definition of trauma I tend to like is too much, too fast, or too little for too long. You can have stress that will build up as a continuum, right? It's a continuum until it reaches that threshold where this is too much and I'm now overwhelmed, right? And that area, that line of overwhelm can vary depending on your resources, material, emotional, energetic resources. So you may feel very depleted and your line is very low and it doesn't take much to be overwhelmed. While you might feel very resourced financially, or having a lot of privilege or whatever it is, or having where you get to that point and the overwhelm line is much higher. So you can tolerate a lot more stress before you become overwhelmed. So stress is, our body has to adapt to perform, to defend from whatever our resting baseline is. That's a stress. And there's good stress, like things that you really want, but you have to still mount some energy towards. It's not like you can just lay in bed and get it done. Like, you may really be looking forward to getting married. It's really like a great thing. And it's a stressor, but a good stress. And then there's toxic stress, which is not so good, or distress, not so good. And so I think it's distress and toxic stress that can accumulate. and become a trauma, or there can be, something can be neglect, right? Where it's the absence of. So yeah, I do think it matters, though I often use the terms quite loosely because many people have a hard time saying they have trauma. Because if they say it, then there's going to have to be an admission of like, wow, what the weight of that is. And so it's easier to talk about other people's trauma than your own. So for many people, stress can be a stand-in term for trauma. It's more easier to say, oh, that was just toxic stress, rather than saying that was traumatic. And especially if the trauma is ongoing and current, it's very hard to say this is traumatic because then the whole world stops,
Mm.
So there's some belief that trauma is like this intensity within us, and that if we can just get it out, we'll be healed.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like I ate something bad, and if I just vomit it out, it'll be healed. Trauma doesn't work that way. I wish it did, or we'd be fine. But if you believe it's something like I have traumatic grief and I just need to cry this certain amount of tears and then I'll be done. Or if I'm so traumatic, there's rage, I just need to punch something enough and then I'm done. So a lot of practices are around catharsis or big vomiting or getting it out, and they just don't work well. If you have shock trauma, right, like a sudden car accident, an assault, single, and you've never had anything else before that, right? It's this, you were like perfect childhood, everything was great, tons of privilege, all resource, and boom, you have which like, who is that person? Boom, they have something that's a shock. That energetic charge in their nervous system can be discharged, or in that idea, released or reset.
Mm-hmm.
But very few people have that. Most people have a complex of some degree of relational trauma, some degree of racialized or gender-based trauma, and maybe some neglect, like, emotional neglect, educational trauma. It's wound up in our growing up and forming our identities and our relationships. And so if you think about that, we know in the research that that type of trauma changes the structure of the brain, changes the function of the brain and the nervous system. The change in the structure of the brain, let alone the function of the nervous system, how are you going to catharsis out or vomit out a part of your brain? Like your hippocampus is smaller, you have less white matter, the way the nerves communicate to each other is different. So there's no way you can just get it out. We actually have to go back and repattern how that experience is held in our emotions, in our body, in our mind, in our understanding, and come to a different relationship with it. It's not about going and reliving it, because when you relive it, it's this idea, if I relive it, I can just get it out. You actually intensify it. The more times you relive it, the more it becomes embedded in your neural networks. We do actually need to go back, but not with the idea of reliving or re-experiencing the trauma. It's how do we stabilize first and have skills, resources, and support internally and externally that allows us to go back and revisit the trauma and talk about it while feeling supported, while feeling safer, while feeling in the present moment. And in that way, we revisit and we repattern our relationship to the trauma. We don't relive it. So we can revisit, but we revisit from a strength-based perspective. And in that way, that's actually when the healing happens. So we do want to go back, but it's not in the idea of like, just gonna go back. Like it was overwhelming the first time. If you don't have new skills or resources, what makes you think it's going to be not overwhelming when you go back now?
Yeah. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the feeling of overwhelm and how that plays in with like safety, and how our bodies can feel safe enough to perhaps revisit something so that we can repattern. How does that work? I guess what I'm trying to get at is if someone is super overwhelmed or doesn't feel safe, how are they going to be able to develop these skills, because they're coming from a place of defense or, being hyper vigilant? How can somebody build?
A huge focus of my work is that what's called the stabilization phase of trauma healing. It's the first phase of trauma healing where it's turbulent, where we feel like we're drowning, where it's crisis and so intense, where we learn how to settle, how to calm, and you actually build those skills like a muscle, like you do repetitions, like you would at the gym. There are concrete skills that we can build, we can learn and practice that will allow us to learn to stabilize and start to be able to find internal safety. Because safety is twofold. Like when someone says this is a safe space, I'm always like, my eyes roll all the way back in my head, because safety is an external condition and an internal condition. No one has control over what happens inside of me. So something could be very safe outside and I could feel unsafe inside, and vice versa. And so this is how to teach people how to develop safety within themselves. And as that happens, you begin to trust your skills to face and feel intensity and settle it. It then becomes okay to start moving closer to the trauma story with a pacing and being aware of like, oh, this is a little too much. I'm going to take a break now. I can tell I need to resource. Now I use my skills, I practice, I resource. Now I can go a little bit closer to this story and repattern a little bit more. Now I come away, right? And so building that muscle. So I literally developed the resilience toolkit for that exact practice. And it's something that I've been doing for many years now with thousands of people and training people how to teach it in many different countries. And so it's super interesting to see what stabilization looks like for individuals, couples, families, collectives, organizations. And it's like honestly fucking amazing.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your resilience toolkit, and also what does resilience mean to you?
So sometimes resilience is used in a very punitive way. It's used in a way of like, hey, you need to be stronger. You need to be more flexible, when actually like your job is making you work too hard and they're telling you, you need to be more resilient, or your partner is saying you need to be more flexible, when in fact they are so rigid that they're making you like just bend over into like contortion. I think we have to be careful because resilience is flexible strength, but we have to be careful because it's easily weaponized to blame individuals or the other person and not take accountability for the conditions we create that decrease people's resilience. So I'm really cautious and like careful around that. And so the way I like to think about resilience is that it is flexible strength, and it is about bouncing back from adversity. It is about the capacities to heal, but it's also about the capacities to transform the relationships, the spaces, the systems that create inequity, oppression, and steal our resilience in the first place. So it's a both and, right? So for me, that's what resilience is. And with that type of resilience, we can change the harmful systems or the harmful relationships, or sometimes leave them, because we have enough resilience to say, my resilient move is, this situation is harmful for me. I have tried and tried and tried, and it is not budging. It is in my best self-interest to leave. That is a resilient move, not always to just withstand more and more and more. And so the toolkit, the resilience toolkit, is designed to help people build stabilization skills, to know inside yourself, are you calm? Are you stressed? Like, as we talked at the beginning, are you a little stressed, a lot stressed? Is it trauma now? And then to ask, we have these guiding questions in the toolkit where it's, what is my state? And then we ask ourselves, how do we know? And so it helps us learn our own language of our own bodies and our own beings better. And then once we know that, it opens up some choice points to ask ourselves, is this useful for me right now? Is this helping me get through? Or am I like overstressed or over responding? Or wait a second, I'm bringing something from 10 years ago that doesn't even belong here. And to take accountability, and then to be able to we use real-time tools. So these aren't like go on a meditation retreat. These are like, what can you do in 30 seconds that can bring the temperature down? And most importantly, how do you know it works? Because there's a lot of practices out there that sort of set up this dynamic that this practice is good, do it. And if it doesn't work for you, what's wrong with you? As opposed to, there are many practices. Different things work for different people at different times. what we're interested in the toolkit is teaching people to be able to evaluate, does this work for me or not? And then to make choices from there. And in this way, it helps people grow those stabilization skills of knowing when is it too much, when do I need to settle, knowing how to settle and settle well, and to trust themselves in their own judgment. And a big part of trauma is not having choice or being powerless. And here in the toolkit, there's so much choice. It's not like you must sit and breathe for 10 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of freedom of choice, which helps restore, is healing in and of itself.
Mm. I've just come across so many practices, and a lot of the rhetoric is like, if it doesn't work, then you didn't try hard enough, or you need to practice more. For example, in the context of birth, there's really popular technique, hypnobirthing or hypnobabies. And if it doesn't work, then you just didn't practice hard enough, and I just think that can be very damaging.
Really damaging. Different things work for different people at different times, but it's like, as a modality, I think it's really important for me as a creator of the Resilience Toolkit to say it doesn't do everything. I know what its limits are, and maybe I'm still learning, right? What the limits are. We know where it works, where it was designed to work, not just have anecdotes. We do research, like independent research. We want to see what happens when people practice a little, a lot, what kind of changes, right? So we can really say, like, these are the limits. And as a community of facilitators, we meet, we talk about it, we continue to learn. And I actually originally developed the toolkit for stabilization. I didn't think it really worked well in the repatterning of the trauma itself. And I've actually come to realize that it does do some of that, but that was not the original intention. You still, I think, do need to have like some psychotherapy or faith-based or cultural practice alongside the toolkit, but the toolkit can do more than I thought. But I just, it's kind of bonkers to me to think that you would have any practice and think it would work globally for everybody. Like, what hubris? Like,
yeah.
People already feel bad enough about themselves. Like, we don't need to pile on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's also a component of capitalism here at play. Like, read this book or do this practice or try this training and then you'll be cured or you'll ascend to the next level of life of healing. And it just doesn't work that way, right?
There's so many ways to get from A to B, or maybe A to G. I don't know where you're going. Maybe it's G to A. If anything, birth has taught me, right, is about flexibility and being humble in the face of powers that are much greater than us. It doesn't mean that we can't develop wisdom. We can't have guidance. Just when I'm absolutely sure of something, I'm like, what's that? If I could I have a problem with giving things away, like that I need to like probably not give so much away. But to me, there's so much suffering. I'm like, if we could get this into everybody's hands, like it's a technology that pairs well with so many things. Yeah, I would like to take a vacation. I think it would be really nice. I'd like all our people to be really well paid and be able to take vacations and have all the things, because we do live in dominant culture where there is not a safety net, right? And so it's like how to be anti-capitalist when there's no safety net. And so like, how do we build mutual aid? Like all the things I'm super interested in. So I have a compassion for folks like trying to make a buck, but I'm never going to make a buck that's not in alignment, because that's a dirty buck I'm not interested in. I mean, it's one of the reasons I had a really hard time working in hospitals as a midwife, really, and as a nurse, really hard time.
Yeah, I'm wondering, since this is a podcast geared towards people who are pregnant or who are hoping to be pregnant, what are your thoughts around informed consent and body safety as it pertains to birth? And I know that's a huge question, but I'm curious what you think of that.
I mean, it's hard to have informed consent when you're talking about also things that can be quite complicated. And so what happens is I find providers will pull like expert cards on folks. Well, you can't read this strip of how your baby's heart rate looks. So we're telling you that, this is what, right? Like, so they'll pull, and like, if you can't read the strip, you don't know that it's actually okay or it's not okay. And so there's a lot of fear. It's like hard to have informed consent when I think there's such unequal power dynamics. There's no interest in leveling power dynamics in the obstetrical system. And I'm going to say something, I've said it in many places, but I'm going to say it now, is I think all the rage and love of doulas are wonderful, but doulas are being used by a system to put lipstick on a pig. Mm-hmm. That the system, the obstetrical system, does not want to acknowledge that it's patriarchal, that it strips people of autonomy. Everybody in obstetrics is terrified of birth, which is just creates like pheromones of fear. And so, of course, we have worse outcomes. It's money and profit driven. I mean, all of the things. And not to say that there are not good people doing great work within that system, but the system at large. And then they're like, we can put a doula here who's really needed because women need and birthing people need that level of support. But instead, it's a way to, instead of saying like, oh, what if we adopted the midwifery model, right? Where it actually fundamentally says something different about how you treat birth as a normal physiological process, right? And so with all that, we're going to do some informed consent, but we're riddled with fear, and we're going to instill fear in you. And how well do we make decisions? How well can we access safety when our providers are afraid of birth? It's a complicated question that you're asking. And I think sometimes we just say, if you give all the information, that's enough. But I mean, like I went to school for years to have all that information. I can transmit a fair amount, but when somebody is in labor, like, really? Like that's the time to do it?
Right.
And so how do you trust with your providers when you have a different provider each time? When I did a home birth practice, there were two of us, two midwives. We had such strong bonds with our birthing families. That trust was built over months and months and months, because you can't basically do informed consent for every possible eventuality. Sometimes you have to do it in the moment.
Right.
And where is the trust, right? And so insurance allowing, I encourage folks to stand up early as possible and find the most trusting place you can. Because sometimes people think if I just have the birth plan will act as my insurance. And I'm going to tell you, from being a nurse for many years in labor and delivery, when someone comes in with a really detailed birth plan in the nurse's lounge, the laughter starts as, here comes the walking C-section.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I tell my clients all the time, the longer the birth plan, the less likely anyone is going to read it.
It's not that they're going to read it. It's the amount of fear that you're trying to control something, right, instead of being able to be trusting of the people who part of birth is surrender. And if you're in this mode of, I need this detailed checklist, the surrender doesn't happen. It's antithetical to the physiologic state where you can't be fighting and birthing at the same time. And so the nurses were right in some ways, because these folks were coming in with these detailed birth lists. They were in fight. They were not in, and so they ended up having very long labors, right? And so sometimes insurance doesn't allow you to have a choice of provider, but sometimes it does. And people mistakenly think that this kind of education or this kind of steel-clad birth plan will insulate them from anything out of their control. And often there's a history of trauma in folks who want that level of control.
Going back to what you said about doulas, I feel a lot of weight on my shoulders every time I go into a hospital as a doula, because in some ways my clients are entrusting me with educating them and giving them space to make decisions. But it's a lot to put on one person to be responsible. I guess what I'm trying to say is I really feel that a lot of people say doulas, they can be very helpful, but it's really hard to truly be a loving, supportive presence when you're feeling like you're, climbing an uphill battle in a hospital setting. I've had a couple doctors say, like, thank God for doulas. Like, we're like the saviors that are like, I think doulas are helpful, but there's no way that that's the solution.
But the thing is, a doula has the least amount of power. You have no power at all. So exactly. How are they saviors? How can you save something when you're not part of writing hospital policy? You can be kicked out at a moment's notice. You have no power. So that's what I mean. I like lipstick. When I say lipstick on a pig, it's not to denigrate the lipstick. It's the impulse to say, we are not going to change the system. We're going to put the window dressing. We're going to put this, and it's support that's really needed. But I'm going to ask you, why is the support needed? Because the system's so broken, right? So instead of addressing the brokenness at root cause, when I did home birth, we didn't have doulas. We labor sat. I mean, if someone wanted one, great, but it was like, it wasn't needed.
Right.
It's not to say like, what might we re-envision where a doula actually has some power in the system? Because you're asking a doula to both be an advocate and a support. Those are two different nervous system states. Loving support and a fighter for you.
Mm-hmm.
Again, doulas are put in this impossible, and with no power.
Yeah.
It's like, can we have doulas and can we also address root causes?
But I would say too, that happens outside the hospital too. I have midwives that are like, oh, hire the doula because she'll really know when it's time for me to show up. Like the whole thing with labor sitting. Like the midwives aren't showing up. They want to come catch the baby, just like a doctor now. Not everyone, I shouldn't say all, but I've noticed a lot of midwives practice that way. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not a provider.
Look at the cost of living, look at what midwives are paid, look at how hard they work. They've got to do a certain number to be able to afford. I remember many years ago, I had a lovely couple. They were from Canada, and we were talking at one visit, and somehow the subject of malpractice insurance came up. So if you don't know, when you practice midwifery obstetrics and you have malpractice insurance, there is a thing called a tail. Do you know about the tail?
I don't know specifically. I know that some midwives don't have medical malpractice. They're just doing the LLC because they get more coverage or higher.
Well, an LLC doesn't protect you from medical
malpractice.
It doesn't. Mm-hmm. It just doesn't. It's not. It's a deterrent, but it will not protect you, which is another conversation. There's a tail on each policy. And so that means the longer you're in practice, the tail starts to grow. So you have to pay more because somebody could sue you for a birth injury up to the child's 18 years old. So if you've been practicing for 10 years, you are now paying for 10 years of a tail of a practice. So look at the cost of that. And what this Canadian couple was saying is, we have a national health. If there's a birth injury, you could maybe sue and there could be for the pain and suffering, but you don't have to pay for the medical care for 18 years of this child's life. And so because we don't have a safety net health system, this is one of the root causes that then is going to impact why providers have to work so hard if they're independent and see so many people because they're paying for insurance. These are root causes. When people say like, oh, I can't deal with the politics, it's too much, it like absolutely impacts on every level our experience. And it's not that everybody needs to do political action at all times, but to pretend that it doesn't. This is why just having a doula doesn't fix like malpractice insurance reform or like for-profit healthcare that it needs to pay shareholders so that providers have less time. I mean, there's so many places that interventions can happen. And so I really appreciate the ability in my own role to work at all levels in healthcare. So whether that is directly supporting birthing families with building resilience, whether that is supporting their providers and the non-clinical folks like doulas, like we run a trauma-informed program for doulas, resourcing them with skills and knowledge, as well as working with hospital administrators, developing policies and procedures, working with health systems on how do we become more trauma-informed. So I have a lovely vantage point that I get to work at all of those levels on the regular basis. Feeds my heart to be able to see the whole thing and be able to impact at multiple levels. I don't know. That was a very long answer. We went really big and meta. Maybe we need to get small and intimate. I don't know.
No, this is great. If there's a birthing person that has a traumatic birth experience, how do you work with them? Do they take the trauma resilience toolkit workshop, or is there a special place that you refer them, or how do you integrate someone that might have had some sort of traumatic birth experience?
So first is your body's got to do some healing. Like it's not something that you do right away. There's like a lot of adjustments, breastfeeding, this type of, you're establishing like rhythms and you're sleep deprived. I think it's generally speaking, so you kind of come out of that early postpartum phase I mean, if it's really crisis oriented, often one-on-one support, but using the toolkit is for stabilization. Basically, how do I recognize when I'm distressed and how do I settle? Like that's it. And I would really just concentrate on that, right? Until there's a feeling of like, you know what? When I'm distressed, I know how to settle. Like the crisis is, it gets a little boring, basically. And then we say, we know there's a narrative here that is really hard. When this person feels a little bit more boring, a little bit more peaceful, we start to say, can we pick up a little bit of it and start to unpack it? And we do it slowly at the person's pace. And at any time it starts to feel like, ooh, this is getting a little spicy, we bring in those stabilization skills. Because I firmly believe the trauma healing should never be as bad as the trauma itself. You've already lived through the worst of it.
Mm.
How do we pace it to be as gentle as possible to not kick up dust? And sometimes we find that this trauma is traumatic because it also connects to something else that's older.
Mm.
And so we end up with a twofer, like we heal both at the same time. And it takes as long as it takes, and you go slow, for cost effectiveness, because it's expensive, right, to be doing individual work. The resilience toolkit can be done on a group basis. So you can learn those stabilization skills and continue, like we run a practice group program. You can choose like 5 sessions a week if you want, just all stabilize. And it's beautiful. You'll still people like will be there 3 months, 6 months, sometimes a year. And then they're like, they may be doing therapy alongside and they're using the stabilization, but it's like much more cost effective.
Mm.
And I actually think there's really a lot of beauty. You learn from each other and there's a lot of relational healing to do it in small groups. So that's like what I would recommend. Like I have a free offering that I developed a class called the Roadmap to Trauma Healing to explain what trauma healing looks like, the 3 steps. Because what happens is a lot of people jump right into trying to repattern the narrative and they're not ready and they start to destabilize and feel worse. So a lot of people are like, trauma healing's terrible. I don't like this. And they're right. And so people will take this, it's like a free, like we do it like a couple times a month. And so when people take it, they will often say, oh my goodness, like I rushed too fast or I need to slow down. And some people will even tell their therapist, can we slow down? And so that ability to use that information wherever you are and whatever modality is like, am I in crisis? Do I need to stabilize? Am I stable enough to start to deal with the meat of what happened? Am I ready to like say, I'm done and what's next?
What do you think about trauma bonding?
It has 2 meanings. There's like a technical like meaning, and then there's the way that we commonly use it. The way it's commonly used is that we bond over our shared traumas, which is not the psychological term. That's what you mean, bonding over shared trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, water seeks its level. It's a lot of charge in your system, right? A lot of fight, a lot of hypervigilance, and somebody's really like calm and mellow. It feels out of reach, like we feel out of sync. We want that same thing that matches. It's like when you're sad, you want sad music, like you want that resonance, right? And so we often will gravitate towards people, places, experiences that are resonant with the state that we're in. And this is why people with trauma will often gravitate to very extreme trauma healing approaches, because they're like in like a phase.
I had a mentor tell me once that like a lot of doulas are doulas because of their trauma. I don't know if that's true because I'm not everyone, but for me, I think it could be true to a certain degree, if I'm being honest.
I would say most people's careers are due to their trauma. People become helpers because they suffered and they don't want anyone else to suffer, or they witnessed suffering that was traumatic and they don't want to witness it anymore. People become helpers and caregivers because they were uncared for. The list goes on and on. I felt powerless, and so now I'm choosing a career where I feel like I have a lot of impact. It could be like negative power, like you can become whatever, serve in the armed forces, like, you know what I mean? Like try to use your power for ending life, or you could use your power for giving life, but you're still trying to seek power. And it often comes from a feeling of powerlessness. I think a lot of us choose. I mean, it's not always, but I don't think doulas are unique. Right. And like, I see people like, I will never be a parent. I will never have children because they had such terrible childhood. Or the reverse. I want to have like an adopt and foster a gazillion children because I was a foster child. Like whenever there's a polarity, very strong black, very strong white, you can bet there's trauma somewhere in there.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I say to my clients all the time, if you're trying to control everything through your experience, the journey of giving birth, there's something about that energy of like clinging or like the control, which might be a little different than what you're saying, but I don't know if it is because it's like such a strong view of how things need to be that's like such an open invitation for Mother Nature to swoop in and say we're not in control.
It is. And, the need for control is often like hyper controlling, micromanaging is a trauma symptom.
Right. Same.
So if unhealed trauma, we're going to avoid any reminder of the trauma. If we felt powerless and out of control in the trauma, we will avoid any possibility of being powerless and out of control. Or the other way, we take no initiative, we collapse, we let anything happen. Again, it's the polarity. Because if I never say no, I never have a chance of somebody overwhelming me, right? So I just am like a limp noodle, whatever.
It's so true, and it's so interesting. I just have maybe one more question for you, just in the interest of time. Pleasure and joy, they don't seem to ever be acknowledged, especially in our culture, in our society. It doesn't seem like it's a priority because it doesn't necessarily make money. So how can your toolkit or your practice help people to recognize the importance of pleasure in terms of our body and our well-being?
It's very interesting. A big part of the toolkit, the very first goal is learning how to recognize signs of stress, trauma, and relaxation. So learning to feel the settling, learning to feel into safety, joy of connection, like those things open up to us. I actually said it earlier today. It's this idea of sort of an anesthetized life where you're kind of in the middle, where I'm not going to venture into any of the difficult feelings, but that also precludes my ability to feel the positive feelings. Like when I can really feel grief, I can really feel love, because in love is always the risk of loss. And in grief is love with nowhere to go, right? As you grow your capacity and your resilience, you actually grow your capacity for pleasure and for joy, which is so life-giving and sustaining and beautiful, because there's so much trauma. Like I can think of also, like as a Jewish person, like transgenerationally, like trauma is how dare you enjoy something when someone else is suffering, right? It's a very much like, oh, don't be too joyful. It's going to be snatched. Something's going to happen, right? That's a very cultural trauma that's passed down. I had a private practice at some point, various points of my career. I worked with a lot of Holocaust children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. And this idea of a cap on how much joy you were allowed to feel. And so as the trauma heals, you have access to joy. Which is a radical act, especially for folks with marginalized identities, where we are supposed to be here for the service and comfort of people with dominant identities. And so what does my joy look like as a Black femme, right? For a mother to have joy, right? A parent to have joy instead of just the service model.
Right.
The breeder model, the service model, the caregiver model, like what would that joy look like?
Yeah, amazing. Where can people find you and connect with your work?
So we're at Lumos Transforms. So Lumos transforms. So just like this idea that we all have light inside of us, and how do we access that light and be transformed by it? That's probably the best place, just the regular old interwebs.
Thank you so much for your time and for working on such important, deep, significant work, I think, for all of humanity. And it really is a regenerative practice, and we really need it, I think. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's really been my pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to share with friends and family, and stay tuned for the next episode.